Welcome to chapter 7, where we are going to discuss populations. We're going to look at population characteristics. We're going to talk about kind of what limits population size, growth curves, all of that good stuff. And so if we look at the outline for this chapter, we're first going to talk about the characteristics of a population. What exactly is a population growth curve, some factors that limit population size. So what are some categories of those limiting factors? Population growth rate, associate some of the factors from human population growth, and then we'll kind of look at what does the future look like in terms of human population growth and kind of all of the other related factors that we see here that we are going to mention. All right, so remember we define a population as a group of individuals of the same species that's in the same area, right? So individuals of the same species living in the same place, interacting with one another, okay? Now, earlier on in the so in our earlier chapters, I mentioned that populations can have differences in their genetics, say from population to population. So for example, a population of raccoons will be genetically different in North Carolina versus California, right, or South Carolina or Georgia or whatever, right? And the genetic differences often are kind of determined by the interactions between those individuals within that population, are kind of defined by the area in which that population lives. Now, we can look at the number of individuals that are added to a population through reproduction over time, and that's referred to as natality. So basically like natal, right? So natality. And we can kind of quantify that based on the birth rate. So for example, maybe there's 1,000 individuals born per year. And then we can also relate that to the mortality rate, so which is basically number of deaths in that population. So if that death rate is the same as the birth rate, then the population's not increasing over time. So it's basically a net zero effect. What we can also look at populations is basically it's known as the survivorship curve, and it shows the proportion of individuals that are likely to survive to each age, okay? And so, for example, you could have a species that has a lot of mortality in their young, so like fish, right? Fish will lay a lot of eggs because a lot of their offspring will die and very few will make it to adulthood. But once they make it to adulthood, mortality tends to go down. Or we could look at somebody like humans, a species like humans, where mortality in infancy and juvenile stages are relatively low, and mortality only increases as they get older. Or it could be something like a bird where mortality is relatively the same regardless of your age class, okay? And so those three types of examples are associated with the three types of survivorship curves. And the type of survivorship curve is actually associated with a number. And the number is, so it's basically referred to as a type 1, 2, or 3. Right? So species that have high mortality in the young is a type 3 curve. Species that have low mortality in their young is a type 1. And then when it's proportional, regardless of the age class, it's a type 2. So for example, humans is a type 1, fish could be a type 3, and then birds are a type 2 survivorship curve. When we look at populations, we already mentioned that we can quantify like birth rate, death rate, and what that can tell us overall is the growth rate of that population. And so you can determine a population growth rate by just looking at the birth rate minus the death rate. And a lot of the times we'll express this as a percentage of the total population. So we do this for humans relatively often. We can also look at populations in terms of sex ratios, so numbers of males to females and proportions of genders to one another. And this is important because females really determine the number of offspring, especially in sexually reproducing populations. And so you may have a population of, say, 1,000 individuals, but the effective population size is really only the number of individuals that's kind of reproducing. And so it's really important to know not only females and male ratios, but also age distributions, because age distributions tells you, the number of individuals in each age class, and the age class will influence the population differently, right? So for example, in humans, if your population is mainly older individuals, so say like 40 and up, your population growth rate is going to be relatively low because 40-year-olds and older aren't really reproducing. Whereas if you're a population whose population is mainly, say, 20 to 30-year-olds, then your growth rate is going to be higher because that's more of the reproducing age class. And so that age distribution, along with sex ratio, really will determine kind of like population growth rate, effective population size. And so when we look at kind of the effect of birth rates and death rates on population sizes, all right, you can see that when you have kind of different age, birth rates and death rates, right? So you have high birth rate, lower death rate, you get pretty good increase. Right, so there's like an 11 difference there. Here you have plus 12, minus 8, so it's a little smaller. And here you have minus 13, plus 9, so actually decreasing in population size. And then if you actually look, and if you also combine this information with age class, it can kind of tell you a little more about what that population is doing. So here's, excuse me, so here's some examples of survivorship curves. So mammals, typical type 1, low mortality rate at younger ages, and then as you increase in age, mortality rate decreases or increases, and so the number of survivors decrease. Birds, that mortality rate's pretty constant. And then, so say like flowers or fish, really high mortality rate early on, right? So very low numbers of survivors at young age. And then as you get older age, the mortality rate decreases. So again, this is the type 1, type 2, type 3 survivorship curve. Now this is showing you kind of the age distribution in human populations and how it affects growth rates. And so for example, if a lot of your population is in the reproductive age, you're getting really rapid growth. So most of that population is in these reproductive age classes. Whereas the United States is fairly even, right? So a lot in the young, a lot in reproductive, a lot, in 45, 50 to 60, 65, And so it's kind of steady growth rate. Whereas Italy, most of their population is in these older age classes and not really in the reproductive age classes. And so they actually have a negative growth rate, which is a function of their age distribution. And so not only is birth and death rates important, but your age distribution is important in terms of how your population is going to change and be affected over time. And now, not only can we determine population numbers and say like population size, population growth rate, etc., we can also look at the density of a population and how it's kind of spatially distributed across an area. So if you have a high population density, then you have a high number of individuals per unit area. Whereas if you have a low population density, you have a low number of individuals per unit area. High population densities tend to injure all individuals in a population because there's a lot of competition for those resources. Whereas low density means that there's more resources per individual. So again, larger the population, usually higher population densities, but again, it depends on basically how much area that population is kind of living in. Now, there are some, behaviors that can affect population density, and that's mainly migration, immigration, and emigration. So basically dispersal. And so dispersal is just movement of individuals from one area to another. So they can immigrate, which is movement out of an area, or they can immigrate, which is movement into an area. So I is in, and then E is out. So immigration or immigration. And so really dispersal doesn't have to be from densely populated areas. It's just that most of the times when areas are densely populated, it benefits the individual to move from that densely populated area so that they can find a less dense area to get more resources per individual, basically. But dispersal can be from low to high or high to low. It doesn't really matter. It's just movement of individuals. But a lot of times you see like from densely populated areas to less dense populated areas. And we can kind of look at the growth of a population, whether it's increasing, decreasing, right? And we can actually map that in a population growth curve. And we can kind of quantify what's known as the biotic potential. So this is the reproductive capacity of a species. So the ability of that species to produce offspring. And the biotic potential usually is much higher than replacement levels. So generally, species will produce more offspring than needed in order to replace themselves. This is due to mortality rates and that sort of thing. And so there's a natural tendency for populations to increase because of that. So if you're, one individual, then you only need to have one offspring to replace yourself. But generally, you have, more than one. For example, I'm a parent. I have 4 kids, so I've replaced myself several times, right? And so I'm adding to increasing the population. And so in natural environments, you see the same thing where that replacement level is generally higher, and so you get an increase in population size. And typical populations will generally follow a really consistent population growth curve where you have kind of this lag phase. So this is a kind of slow population growth. But then once it gets to a certain point and reaches a certain threshold, it transforms into this exponential rapid growth. Okay? So you have more organisms reproducing, causing a lot of growth, and it continues until you get more death rates than birth rates. Once you start getting more death rates than uh, birth rates, so when they start to equalize, so maybe like in exponential growth, you're having like 4 births to every 1 death, right? That's going to lead to pretty quick population growth. But then as population increases, then maybe you're getting like 3 deaths for every 2, and then maybe, or 2 births to every, or 3 births to every 2 deaths, and then maybe every 2 births you have 2 deaths. And then so then you get your kind of rapid increase. Now you're starting to go down, and now you're kind of equal, right? So there's no population growth. And so you get that deceleration to that stable equilibrium. And that's basically what that stable equilibrium is where that death rate and birth rate become equal. And so that deceleration is when that growth rate's slowing as the death rate and birth rate become equal. And what kind of drives this typical curve is that, fairly early on when populations are low, they have a lot of resources per individual. And then that means that they can have a lot of offspring. And so they'll have a lot of offspring, and they'll have higher replacement. And then they'll grow exponentially. But then as more and more individuals are added to the population, resources become less and less abundant per individual. So deceleration happens until you reach carrying capacity, which is basically determining how many resources are available for that population. And so there are factors known as limiting factors that create a scenario where it prevents the unlimited population growth from happening. And these different limiting factors are known as environmental resistance. Okay. Now we can have extrinsic limiting factors. So this is outside of the population itself. So things like predators, right, or resources, lack of thereof, or just disasters, wildfires, tsunamis, hurricanes, etc. Right. And so one example of predators is like a lynx-hare relationship, where if you get a lot of lynxes, right, to increase in population size, the hare population, right, let's say it's high, will go down when lynx populations is high, because you have a lot of predators eating a lot of prey, right? And so then once hare population declines, then the lynx population will decline because they have less food, right? And so you get these predator-prey dynamics, and so you actually see a cyclical effect where you kind of have this lag, where when the hares are high, lynx are high, but when lynx becomes high, it drives the hare population low. When hare population gets low, lynx population gets low. And then when lynx population is low, there's not as many predators, so hare population goes up. And lynx population goes up because more hare. So you get this cyclical effect, right? Now, intrinsic limiting factors are those that come from that population itself. So like behavioral changes that lead to lower birth rates or higher death rates, etc. And so there can be what's called density-dependent limiting factors and density-independent limiting factors. This hare-lynx relationship is a density-dependent limiting factor, but it's an extrinsic limiting factor, so it's coming from out of that population. Density-independent limiting factors are basically factors that control a population that aren't related on density. And density dependent is a function of density. So for example, as populations become more and more dense, resources per individual goes down, and then mortality rates increase. Density independent limiting factors would be something like climate dictating the number of populations, right? So like maybe mosquitoes do better when there's more water, And so in wetter years, you would have larger mosquito populations than in drier years. And so the population size has nothing to do with density. It has more to do with the availability of water, because that's what they lay their eggs in, is water. Um, and so you have those density dependent versus independent limiting factors. The most often the limiting factors are things that are associated with resource availability, so like raw material availability or energy availability, the accumulation of waste products, or biotic interactions. So biotic interactions can also limit population size, which again is like your predator-prey interactions. And so, an example of density dependent is like your number of bacteria. As they increase, they become stable, but then they become so large that their mortality rates increase because they use up all of the resources, and then you just get a crash once those resources are used up, because they basically overuse their resources, and so they basically cause their population to crash because of that. But now, if the resources, so this could be something in like a petri dish, right, where the bacteria eventually use all of the sugar that's in the petri dish, and so then their numbers will crash. But typically within a population, there's a carrying capacity. A natural population has a carrying capacity where it's just the maximum size of the population that area can support based off of its biotic and abiotic factors, right? And so this carrying capacity is not static, right? So it's not like, oh, for this fish, it will always hold 1,000 individuals. It actually can fluctuate, and it can be influenced by a lot of different environmental factors. So it could be like changes in successional stages, climate. Is it a wet year or is it a drought year? Was there a fire? Has there been a flood? Are there diseases? Is there more nutrients this year than last year because of increased runoff or something along those lines? And so instead of seeing kind of like this typical curve where this stable limit here is flat, what you typically see is some sort of like oscillation around the carrying capacity, right? And you can get like an average carrying capacity. But depending on the species, you could have something like, kind of like a dampening, where it starts out really, really high fluctuations and then kind of becomes stable, or it's kind of always fluctuating, or something in between. So it just really depends on those environmental factors. And so again, your carrying capacity is going to be pushed down by all of these factors. And so without these limiting factors, populations would increase infinitely, right? But these limiting factors are driving this typical lag exponential stable limit population size growth curve, population growth curve that we just learned about. Now, population sizes, like we mentioned, will typically kind of follow these curves, but you also can get interesting strategies that lead to varying population fluctuations that kind of follow these K strategist or R strategist life cycles. And typically, and so what I should first say is that these are kind of extremes of reproductive strategies, and typically species will kind of fall in between these with like maybe a couple K strategist characteristics and maybe like one or two R strategists, and vice versa. But we typically divide species between these two reproductive strategies. And so a K strategist is an organism that basically reaches a stable population once it reaches carrying capacity. Our strategists are usually they don't reach a carrying capacity, and they kind of go in these fluctuations with like fast growth, crash, etc., and are typically like small organisms. Um, K strategists are like live slow, live long. R strategists typically follow um, live fast, die young um, life history strategies. And so K strategists will usually be in a relatively stable environment, larger organisms, typically longer lived, produce fewer offspring, so they don't use as much of their energy for producing offspring, but they put a lot of energy in terms of care for their offspring. So typically a type 1 growth curve, and they're really limited based off of density dependent limiting factors. Right? So basically, as population gets larger, resources become less available because of increased density, so mortality rates increase, um, and so that kind of keeps that population size stable. For our strategists, it's kind of the opposite. Small, short-lived, lots of offspring, so much energy put into, say, laying a lot of eggs, little parental care, if any. Usually it's like fish laying an egg, a bunch of eggs, and then going on and those eggs hatching and those individuals kind of fending for themselves. They live in typically unstable environments. They typically have that boom bust cycle like you see here. They'll jump up in population size and then crash, and then jump up and crash. Um, and so their reproductive strategies basically is to produce a lot of offspring to overcome high mortality, so that they can survive whatever environment they're in. And our strategists are typically controlled by density independent factors, whereas K strategists are those dependent factors usually. And so here's a table that just kind of summarizes those K strategists versus R strategists life history cycles. But most animals typically don't have an all or nothing in these strategies. They will have characteristics from both of these, but we usually kind of lean more towards one type of strategy. But again, it just depends on the species. And so a lot of animals will actually kind of show these cyclical periods with large populations, with crashes to small populations. So some of those boom bust cycles that we just mentioned. Now that we've kind of learned about population growth and population cycles and say animals and natural environments and ecosystems, we're kind of going to look at human population growth for the rest of the chapter. And so big reason for increasing human population is, we have good medical care. We effectively handle a lot of diseases, and so our mortality rates have went down a lot, especially over the last 150, 200 years today compared to then. And so our doubling time for human population is really 70 divided by annual rate of increase. And so with an annual rate of increase of 20%, we're looking at a doubling rate of the population every 35 years, which is really fast. And so you get a growth curve that looks like this. We have a really long lag phase, but we have this crazy exponential growth phase. And we're looking at just insane numbers in terms of human population in the next 25 years or so, to where 87, well, let's see, 1960, we were only at 3 billion people. And then within 100 years, we're going to add 3 times that many people, almost, right? 2.5 times that many people. So it's just crazy in terms of how much population is growing. And so, here's a doubling time. And so based off of whatever your rate of annual increase is, this is what your doubling time looks like. So years to double the human population. And so if we're sitting at 2%, we're looking at 35 years. 4% is every 18 years. And then if it's lower, it's even longer. But doubling time is relatively fast. for a human population. Um, when we look at human population, we can kind of divide it into two groupings: your more developed countries versus your less developed countries. More developed countries typically have per person in per capita income of 25,000. So like Europe, US, Japan, Australia, etc. Our combined population in those well-developed countries are about 1.25 billion. Relatively stable populations and about a 5% growth rate within the next 25 years. But when we look at less developed countries, they have less income, pretty much all the other remaining countries, and that population is 6/7 of the population, so majority of the population. Um, Almost 900 million people live on less than $1.90 per day, which is no money at all. Really high population growth rates. Expected to be around 8.5 billion by 2050. So this number here is going to go up by 2.5 billion. Almost a 50% increase. And it's going to be about 87% of the world's population, which is pretty staggering numbers. And so human population growth is really tied to economics, finances, economic development. And so population density, we're looking at the size of the population to its available resources. So countries with abundant resources can have higher population densities for longer periods of time than these poorer countries. But what we're seeing is these poorer countries tend to be growing faster. And then their technological development is much slower. And so what we also see, though, is that highly developed countries are using much more resources compared to those poorly developed countries. And so there's this affluence where, we're consuming much more resources. Our environmental footprint is much larger. Our environmental impact is much larger than what it would be if we were living sustainably. And technology is a real big contributor to that increased environmental impact. So like your firewood to heat, deforestation, power plants, pollution, less wind, solar energy for lower environmental impacts. And so these are very high, this is very low, and these should be switched. Right? So what we want to get at, that being switched. And so we can, look at our ecological footprint, where we're basically measuring the amount of area required to provide the resources and to absorb the waste of a population. So you can look at your own individual ecological footprint, which is what you will do or have done if you've done it already in one of your check-ins, your discussions, where you go in and you answer questions about how you live your life in terms of resources used, energy used, pollution because of those energy uses, and it shows you if everybody lived like you, how many Earths it would take to sustain us. So if 7 billion people lived like you live, how many Earths worth of resources will we need? More developed countries have a much larger ecological footprint than represented by their land area. So for example, Japan is really developed, has few resources. It's 5 times larger than its locally available resources. So it's using 5 times the resources than what it actually has. U.S. ecological footprint is about 1.5 times that individual's local available resources. That's a big issue because we're not living sustainably. Right? It means we're over consuming our resources. And we're also influencing or influenced by social, political, economic, ethical, moral factors, and so we can make decisions on how we live and how we use those resources. It's just whether or not we make those changes to adjust and live our lives accordingly based off of what resources we have available. And so kind of moving along and continuing the discussion about population, right? So there's biological factors that influence population growth rates. Demography, right, which is where we look at populations and their characteristics and how those characteristics affect growth. Uh, Looking at the study of demography, we find that the basically the rate of growth is how many women are having children and the number of children that female will have. So this leads to a calculation or a statistic where you can get the total fertility rate, which is the number of children a woman has in her lifetime, and you can look at a total fertility rate per population. And so a total fertility rate is known as, 2.1 is known as replacement fertility. So basically, parents produce two children who will replace their parents when they die, right? So a zero population growth is when birth rates equal death rates, which we've already talked about that. And we've talked about how age distribution affects that population growth. Okay? And so, for example, my replacement fertility is higher than what's necessary. Or my total fertility is higher than the replacement fertility. So we have 4. So that's going to lead to, if everybody did that, it would be a larger population growth rate. Social factors are, things like reducing fertility rates. But then you have cultural beliefs, like religious beliefs and traditional beliefs that influence how many kids or offspring a couple would have. Then you have social factors determining like family size, the status of that family, and then the desires again of those cultural influences. And then also how that culture views what the roles of the male and female are in those households. And so all of those kind of social influences determine how many children are going to be born per family. And so, early marriages have higher fertility rates. For example, in Africa, 23% of births are in the teen range. And so the total fertility rate, about 5%. Practices of child rearing influence population growth rates. So if you're, for example, population is big on breastfeeding, there's a lot of benefits that come from that. Nutrients, antibodies that are useful for keeping the child healthy, but then also the months in which a woman is breastfeeding, generally, they're less likely to become pregnant. It's basically like a natural birth control, but that's not always the case. A lot of times you can still become pregnant while breastfeeding, but it helps to reduce that from happening. Lack of education in, say, your underdeveloped countries lead to higher fertility rates. So a lot of countries where the average person has more education, they typically have lower fertility rates because they typically have financial independence, marriage later in life, mainly because they're focusing on education younger, or they're knowledgeable about consequences and what it takes to raise a child, etc. Influences of birth control, access to those things. All of these have a lot of effects in the total fertility rate. Where you have infant mortality being high, typically you'll have large families because unfortunately children may not live to adulthood in those cultures and in those countries. And so parents tend to feel more secure in those areas where they have many children to potentially look after their own needs and age, or to help, do the work that's needed in terms of raising livestock or crops or whatever they need to get resources in those families. And so here are just some figures that are kind of showing those data associations with the percent, say, of early marriage and birth, percent of women 15 to 19, say in Africa, Asia, or developed worlds, total fertility rate. So you're seeing the increase or the positive association there. So it's just, more educated, more developed, tends to have lower fertility rates versus those underdeveloped, poorer countries because of all of the culture-based, socioeconomic, also resource, based associations. Economic factors that affect human population growth are things like less developed countries. Economic benefits of children are huge. So young children can contribute to the family economy, like I just mentioned. In developed world, it tends to be the opposite effect. They cost much more. They don't really work until they're 15, 16, and require substantial amount of income to raise. Political factors, you can have governments that reward or punish low versus high fertility rates, again, depending on the culture. Examples, European countries are concerned with low birth rates, so a lot of European countries are having declining populations. So they're actually giving paid maternity leave, job availability on return to work, providing childcare facilities, tax deductions to try to increase the population growth rate. Some developing countries, though, are concerned that population growth rate's too rapid and have imposed limits on population growth. And so this table just kind of looks at population characteristics of the 10 largest populous countries in 2016. So the current population versus the births compared to the deaths, total fertility rate, percentage of population that's less than 15 years old, etc. And so you just kind of see, more developed countries tend to have, differences in, or I should say lower total fertilities compared to those poorer countries. Immigration policies can influence population growth rates. So birth rates can be so low that countries where immigration is encouraged, basically to offset the mortality rate and the decline in that population. Developed countries tend to be under pressure to accept immigrants. And so there's an effect on the population growth in those areas, depending on which side of the effect you're on. And so there's an inverse relationship typically between the country's growth rate and its standard of living. So basically the quality of life that you have in that culture. So you typically see like standard of living being analyzed versus compared to your health conditions, social status, and economic well-being. And so typically your growth rate is lower with your better standard of living versus higher with your lower standard of living. And so there's this kind of important measure of standard of living where you can have a specific purchasing power per person, right? So your GNI, your gross national income, basically says that you have a purchasing power to get total goods and services for your citizens in a country. Right? So basically, the higher that is, the more purchasing power you have. And so your GNI PPP, gross national income purchasing power parity, is to account for varying prices of goods and services between countries. Right? So you can basically use those metrics, standard of living, the GNI, etc., where you can compare that, right, with the total fertility rate for, say, the United States, which has a higher GNI, higher education, higher life expectancy, lower infant mortality rate, with that total fertility rate. Right? You see it's lower versus somebody who's in the opposite, like Kenya, tends to be higher when those are average education's lower, life expectancy is lower, mortality rates higher, and your GNI is significantly lower, right? And so that birth rate, our fertility rate tends to go up. And so what we see though with population growth, we know that the world population is increasing and it's expected to double right around every 35 years or so. Is that when you get in population growth, you get increased demand on those resources. People in developed countries can buy their food, though less developed countries can't. And so the demand for food increases, but then the ability to gather that food and get that food is dependent on your standard of living. And so, we only can increase in size though if plant and animal populations decrease. So basically, there has to be this exchange, this trade-off, and one population increasing versus the other decreasing because the resources are static, right? They're not changing much. And then also people in less developed countries generally feed at lower trophic levels than in the developed world. So poorer countries tend to eat more plants compared to more developed countries eating more meat. Lack of protein can lead to malnutrition, can lead to starvation, leads to higher mortality rates. And we see that Westerners, more developed people, more developed populations tend to be overweight. And we see that a lot in North America and the US. And so, countries where you have this food shortage, agricultural land is pretty much already being overused and overexploited. And many more developed countries are basically those net food exporters. And so just kind of getting better at getting that food to those poor countries is a big way to kind of get at that hunger and food issue. And so solving the food distribution problem though is not easy. Food aid is an excellent service, but it's only temporary relief. It's not allowing those populations to be self-reliant and self-sufficient, and that's an issue that we really haven't figured out yet. And so again, this is just a figure showing that population difference, right? So if you're poor, you're mainly feeding on those grains. If you're more developed, you're eating that meat. And so what we see is kind of this demographic transition where population growth is based on historical, social, economic development. And so initially countries will have a stable population, death rates fall, populations grow, industrialization occurs, they become more developed, birth rate falls, death rates and birth rates will find an equilibrium. Right? So this is kind of this transition concept. And so this is a pretty good model because it suggests industrialization will lead to population stabilization, but can you apply this model that's been developed based off of developed countries to these less developed, poorer countries where resources are no longer abundant, where human populations are growing much more faster than what we're seeing human populations in these two areas? And so, it's really hard to kind of transition this idea to a country that is in a much different scenario than the country that this transition model was built in, right? To where you get this stable population size after that industrialization and that transition. And so looking at kind of the US population picture, we had that baby boom period after the war. So 47 to 61, you have birth rates that were much, much higher than what they are today. So you have this population bulge. And then as those members raise their families, they've had a significant influence on population growth. And so, for example, you see that population bulge moving up, right, as they get older, and kind of it trickles down, leading to larger age classes. compared to what they were before that population bulge. And so looking at all this, what does that mean with the future? So we have to remember interactions are all connected. And so what we do is going to determine and affect global, or it can have global implications, regional implications. Right? And so what we really need to think about are those factors that are affecting, population. So amount of materials, amount of energy, what are we going to do with our waste, and how do we affect the organisms that we're interacting with? Right? And so in terms of raw materials, it's not limited to the amount of food, but how we distribute that food. We're dependent on technology, and so our lifestyles are tied to the use of other resources, so like irrigation water, so water that's not even in our immediate area but comes from other places. What about available energy? So it's really similar to this raw issue dilemma, where we have increasing energy efficiency, but the development of renewable fuels has to increase, so we're not so dependent on those fossil fuels. And we have waste disposal issues, right, where pollution is a product of our activity, but we don't really have good waste disposal methods, and we need to kind of increase our disposal methods and capabilities. And we're not the only species of importance, right? We kind of look at ourselves as being this, on the, top tier on the totem pole, but that's not really the case, because we rely on other species for resources, and if we displace species, they're going to cause ecosystems to go crazy and out of whack, and it's just what we do really matters. And so we should think about the natural environment in terms of our own well-being, because we need to have this kind of ecosystem holistic approach. And so current technology, medical knowledge, right? We're controlling human population growth. We're controlling birth rates and death rates, lowering death rates, increasing, or, even if we keep birth rates stable and lower mortality rate, that still leads to a population increase, right? And so we have to, take that into consideration, and whenever we think about, how our population is going to change, and make decisions based on, historical data, social situations, and think about what we desire versus what we actually need to provide that sustainable footprint, and to lower our ecological footprint. And so if we continue to grow at our current rate, which is about 1.2%, right? And so our estimates that, remember, 2% were 35 years. We're a little less than that, but we're still going to be at about 10 billion people by 2050. We're at 7 billion now, and that's like 3 more billion. That's adding 50% of our population almost in less than 25, or around 25 years. And we've got the same biological constraints as other species. We do have a carrying capacity, and we will reach that carrying capacity. We'll stabilize, but that stabilization means bad things for the population that's not able to gather the resources and get the resources, because in order for that to stabilize, you got to have mortality equaling birth rates. So if our birth rates are high, that means our mortality rates are going to be high as well, in order for that population to stabilize. And so we just need to take that into consideration in how we look and go about our daily lives, right? And so again, as always, look at our summary points, use those for starting areas to study. As always, let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. Shoot me an email, put in the discussion boards, and as always, and again, if I don't answer your email in 24 hours, make sure you send me another one, just in case it gets lost. I want to make sure I answer everybody's email in a timely manner. So yeah, and so with that, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you in the next chapter.